Okay, everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome. Before we begin, I need to do my annoying little logistics. That first of all, I need to tell you that the session is being recorded and will be available as a podcast and on YouTube. And so for that reason, I kindly ask you to silence your mobile phones. And then finally, in the event of a fire, the assembly point for the Old Theatre is outside of the Source Hui Hock building, and we will guide you there. So with that out of the way, it is my big pleasure to welcome you back to the Cutting Edge lecture series in the International Development Department at the LSE. And in today's session, we're going to be talking about competition, trade, sustainability in agri-food markets in East and Southern Africa, a comparison of citrus and soy. I think this is such an important topic. Agriculture is, a sector that employs the majority of people in many countries. It's also a huge contributor to the GDPs of many countries. And often kind of the mainstream donor approach to agriculture is to focus on what's going on with the farmer and on the farm, thinking about giving them inputs and credits and improving their access to markets. But the farmer is a part of a bigger system, right? And there are a number of trends that the farmer is affected by, including climate change, including the kind of what's going on in input and supply chains, what's happening in terms of digitization, what's happening in terms of shifting trade. And so we really need to kind of look beyond the farm to understand agricultural productivity, to understand agriculture's place within the broader process of structural transformation. So I'm hoping today's lecture is really going to kind of push our eyes up to these broader trends that are affecting farmers and farms. And also to give us a couple of very nice empirically rich case studies and to really look at in detail at these bigger issues. So we're very, very lucky to have Professor Simon Roberts to join us today. He is a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg, where he founded the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development, CCRED. He also has an affiliation with SOAS at the moment, where he's working in their Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation. His work straddles competition economics and industrial development, and he's published widely in many academic journals, including World Competition, Journal of Competition Law and Economics, Development and Change, and the Journal of International Development. He's also somebody who's actively worked in policy work, having worked in the UK with the Competition and Markets Authority, and in South Africa with the Competition Commission of South Africa. In recent years, he's also established an African Market Observatory at the CCRED, which is focused on agri-food markets in the context of climate change, and I think he's going to be talking about that and the work that they do. So we're also very lucky to be joined by our wonderful discussant, Professor David Luke, who is a colleague as a professor of practice and the strategic director at the Firoz Lauji Center for Africa. A lot of his work focuses on African trade policy and regional trade integration, as well as on the implications of the climate crisis for African development and sustainable industrialization. And like Simon, his work has also straddled both academia and policy making. He's worked with the African Union, the UN Development Programme, and UNICA, the Economic Commission for Africa. A couple of years ago, he published How Africa Trades, a book about regional trade. And in February or March next year, he has a new book out on agriculture and food called How Africa Eats. And I have joked with him in the past that I'm waiting for How Africa Kicks about football, because he's also a big fan of Man United. So, however, for tonight, he's going to be focused on food and agriculture. So we're going to let Simon speak for about 45 minutes to 55 minutes, and then give David the chance to make some comments and open us up for a discussion. So without further ado, can we please give a round of applause and welcome Simon to the podium.
Thanks very much, Flora. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great opportunity also to engage with Professor Luke, the discussant as well, some of his work I've read. So the first thing I think is just, I'm actually going to be looking at citrus and soy to poultry, because basically soybeans is all about animal feed. There's a little bit comes into vegetable oil, but close to 80% of it is basically about chickens. Right, so that's just a bit of a flag there. Obviously in other countries it may be feed for other livestock, just to make that clear. And I'm also going to highlight, as I go through, that this is all based on kind of joint work that's been done. So Laura gave me lots of credit. It's all about, we have a team of people in the center at the University of Johannesburg, about 15 people, and we work on markets, essentially, markets and rules for markets. So rules for markets means rules that competition authorities set. If it's energy markets, energy regulators, telecoms markets, telecoms regulators, etc., financial. So we work on the interface between those rules and how markets operate, and we do it across East and Southern Africa. So we've got a big kind of international, regional focus within global market dynamics. And so if you look at our website, you'll see it's very eclectic. There's stuff on Airbnb and digital markets next to chickens, right? So it's kind of next to cement. So it's really it's quite broad in that sense, but more focused in terms of the contribution. All right. So in terms of today's talk, I just wanted to use this phrase. It's come from a couple of articles in around 2015 by a group of eminent economists, mainly US-based, who work a lot in different African countries, Thomas Jane, Tom Reardon, etc. And they said there's been a quiet revolution in African food markets, agri-food markets, happened. And that's because there's been a lot of market facilitation measures, trade facilitation measures, and there's been the spread of international traders, storage facilities, and processors. We can discuss the extent to which that's actually happened, but certainly we've had a huge effort over 30 years or so on trade facilitation. There's also been lots of work around how to use digital platforms, digitalization, farmers have apps, etc., to ensure that markets are more efficient. Right? Food markets are more efficient. And basically what my lecturer is doing is saying, okay, what's the reality check? Like what's really going on the ground in these two value chains, essentially. So that's where we're going. In terms of the trade, sustainability, and competition nexus, the trade flows are obviously central for those of you who've looked at something, obviously, because you've got major urban areas in Africa and you've got major centers of production, and because of colonial borders, there's often a difference between where it's produced and where it's consumed. That's the kind of very basic, obvious facts. If you take Brazil and you put it on Southern Africa, to move from where you're growing the soya and the maize to where you're eating the chickens in Southern Africa is across one or two borders. So that's about trade. But it's also about trade in the context of climate change, because we've got extreme weather events, and I'll look at this and give some examples, which are floods and droughts in particular locations, but not very far away in East and Southern Africa, there's good rains and good weather. So trade is essential to mitigate the effects of extreme weather from climate change. I'm going to look at the La Nina and El Nino impacts in East and Southern Africa. So trade is essential. This is very much kind of about how trade works being essential for that. And in the context of what I'm talking about, a lot of the debates are about reducing the emissions from agriculture, right? I'm talking not about that. I'm talking about adaptation. How African agriculture and producers along the value chain are having to adapt to climate change. Almost no emissions obviously have been created by African countries outside, well, South Africa, where I work, has created lots of emissions, but apart from that, but are bearing the effects. But a lot of the emphasis is still on like reducing fertilizer usage, for example. Well, most African countries use almost no fertilizer. I mean, the quantities are tiny, especially if you take out the sugar and tobacco kind of commercial crops, okay? So I'm talking about adaptation and mitigation for sustainability through these markets. And then what about the competition? That's the trade, that's sustainability. What about the competition? Well, how do markets actually work? What's really going on? When we talk about competition, we're talking about whether the markets have got market power involved in them. And the only way to find that out is to go and really look on the ground, right? So lots of the time, work that's done kind of assumes away these things, either because the models assume perfect competition implicitly, or they assume it away because the data's not there. So we say, well, we'd like to know, but we don't. And that's where the market observatory comes in. We went to start looking at food markets about 3 to 4 years ago because of climate change. We said, let's get the data and let's look at what's going on. Like, the data's terrible. So we started building an observatory to collect the data. This is really work in progress, right? So very happy for all contributions and comments on this. And we work together with competition authorities in the region and research centers in different countries. You'll see on the various working papers. I'm not going to go through because there's quite a lot of different working papers looking at different things. This is rough. This is who we are. There's a few people not in the picture because they didn't make it for this. There's about 3 or 4 of us. And this is just to emphasize, this is very much not my work. This is very much a team based at the University of Johannesburg that's doing this work. The citrus stuff is all being done by Shingi's on the Shingi Chisoro is on the bottom right-hand side. The soya to poultry work, I mean, everybody teases me, we've all done work on chickens. And I'll show you why. The emissions, just want to put this up, this is the kind of stuff that's talked about mainly, which is about how much emissions are coming from agriculture, mainly from production, and therefore we must reduce emissions from agricultural production. This is from land use and from things like fertilizer, okay? But this is not the major issue for most African countries, which is about adaptation. And this is then what's been happening kind of on the ground in the last 2 years. So on the left-hand side, you've got the La Nina drought in the Horn of Africa. So dark red is less than 55% of normal rainfall, moving upwards. So really, really severe drought in the Horn of Africa and parts of Kenya. But really good rain in southwest Tanzania and very reasonably favorable conditions in Zambia, Malawi, etc. So you've got this potential to meet the demand in Kenya and the Horn of Africa from Tanzania and Zambia. Just for scale, so I think it's important, Zambia is twice the size of Germany, right? With a population of 20 million people. There is an abundance of land. Zambia is only using 15% of its arable land. I still kind of say this and I don't really believe it. We've done work with the International Growth Center, and I said, if you've gone to Zambia, you'll know there's lots and lots of it's really a relatively flat country, and that's just of the arable land. There's national parks, there's areas which are wetlands, etc. Tanzania, large population, but still only farming less than 50% of the available arable land. This is the best area in the world to expand agriculture. Okay. So this is absolutely, so the question is, why then do countries have the highest food prices in the world and are importing food? Why is this region not being able to meet the demand in Kenya and from within the region? Okay? El Nino, it switches. Drought in southern Africa. That's this year. That's the last 12 months. That's drought in parts of Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa's hit, Botswana's hit. Botswana is dry most of the time anyway, so it's a net food importer. Tanzania and Kenya, lots of water. Uganda, lots of water. Now that doesn't mean the water's falling when farmers expected it. So rain-fed agriculture is still a challenge, which means you need investment in irrigation, etc. And there are floods, which impact as well, okay? But in terms of the land and water availability, absolutely abundant in terms of the potential to expand agriculture. And there's very low yields in lots of this part of it. So what's then happened in those 2 periods to maize prices, which is the main staple crop? Okay? Left-hand side is maize prices, and this is the market observatory. When I say prices, pretty much all the time I'm talking about bulk prices that are traded in tons. So this is a price, this is the intermediate price, the kind of intermediaries that are buying and selling tons of product, okay? Traded across borders. It's not the farm gate price, and it's not the price that the consumer pays for the milled maize, for example, okay? This is your kind of bulk price. And this is the price that's not transparent at all. The drought in Horn of Africa pulled up prices right across East Africa, and in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam pulled up prices from around $300 a ton to over $500 a ton, okay? Almost doubled. Now, people say it's the Russia-Ukraine war. The Russia-Ukraine war pulled up prices by 50%. Prices doubled. They went up by much, much, much more This and a combination of the drought. Zambia and Malawi were net exporters in those years. Those are the prices. In fact, Zambian and Malawian farmers in the middle of 2021, their prices were incredibly low, just above $100 a ton. Really, there was a real issue about whether farmers were able to afford seed, etc., incredibly low. So you've got massive wedges in there, huge wedges, massive markups, including over transport costs. So with all of this quiet revolution, it's meant to have improved efficiencies of transport. So let's add on the transport costs, land it in Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, and you've got this massive wedge on top that happened. You can see it was around the import price plus transport, and you've got this massive additional markup that's coming on top. This is what I mean about our markets working in practice, not in theory. And there's two things really going on as far as we can say. One is there are ad hoc trade restrictions, export bans are being put on. These countries are all within essentially free trade areas, right? So, but there's export bans being put on, and there's this irrational, people say you shouldn't do it, etc. But there's also big trader margins because there are licenses which go to traders to supply the product. So the ban is not irrational if you've got the license, right? The ban is a political economy, essentially a political economy argument here. So massive profiteering taking place in response to that drought. This year, it's flipped over. Malawi is now an importer of maize this year, not an exporter. An importer of maize, Tanzania, in the southwest of Tanzania, because there's big margins between southwest of Tanzania and Dar es Salaam within the country, it's a huge country, has been exporting, has had more maize to export than the whole of the deficits, in fact, than the whole of Malawi's demand, not just the net deficit. So 4 million tons to export. Malawi's annual demand is about 2.5 million tons. They needed less than 1 million tons. So abundant production. These are the Malawian prices. And this is directly impacting on poverty rates in what is already one of the poorest countries in the world. This is what we're tracking. And transport, this is a country, these countries have borders, this is a border. The transport costs are conservatively estimated at $50 to $60 a ton. This is still quite high, and you have these huge wedges. In November 2023, the Malawian government, the big dip there, the Malawian government imported from Mozambique. The marketing board that imported from Mozambique, there was then a political outcry about the big traders because they were obviously getting the maize at a much higher price, and I think the head of the marketing board was removed and the prices went up again. So this is the political dimension that's happening. So I'm pointing out that this is the terrain of food markets that we really think needs to be, there's a big focus needs to be on. All right, that's the kind of big picture context, right? I'm going to then go to soya. So soya is not about maize, it's very political in many countries, there's lots of political economy around it. So let's go to soya. Soya is for animal feed, intermediate product, isn't subject to these kind of trade restrictions so much, and let's look at what's going on in soya. The first thing is the global picture is that soya is essentially only produced and exported in two countries. Right? So on the right-hand side, you can see global production, America and Brazil, Argentina in third place, fourth and fifth, India and China, they're both net importers. Okay, so you've got a global supply and demand balance in soya. It's kind of crazy. It's the most concentrated commodity in the world. Right? And it's also the most concentrated in terms of who trades it. Okay? And then you've got, looking to the left, you've got meat consumption, protein consumption. And you can see where what's driven the main growth in Brazil's production export, which is that China now consumes the same meat per capita as the European Union, 100 kilos per capita. That's happened over a couple of decades, and that's driven the Brazilian expansion. Okay? And remember, if we go back to land use, if countries such as India, many African countries are going to carry on growing urban incomes and increasing their consumption of protein, where's the soya going to come from? So it won't necessarily be pork, but it'll be things like fish and chicken, etc. So you can see where India is, and just think about what happens when as Indian incomes in urban areas in India go up from 12 kilograms per capita today. Okay, so this is a big change. and Africa's at 26 kilograms, put Zambia there at 28. So we're going to see this growth of demand taking place. And where's the best area of the world to expand agricultural production? Tanzania and Zambia and Uganda, right? And Malawi and Zambia are exporting to China hundreds of thousands of tons of soybeans last year and soy meal. So it's already this global picture is already impacting on land use there. So the soybean is all intermediate product. It's all essentially, in African countries, we're doing work in Kenya as well right now, it's to an incredible extent all for chickens, right? Cattle is, a lot of the cattle is feedlots, it's for free range, and then the silage, and there's some feed being used. In South Africa, there is more commercial feed being used, but chicken is the main user. So let's look at the buyer side and see how these value chains are being organized. And on the buyer side, commercial chicken production is all about converting your feed into your meat as efficiently as possible. So if you're going to compete as a chicken producer, you want to feed your chicken as little as possible for it to add a kilo of meat. So if you imagine a chicken is about 2 kilos, how much feed do you think you need to feed it to get to 2 kilos? The answer is about 3.5 kilos of feed. Right, so the feed conversion ratio is about 1.6 to 1.9, right? So and that clearly is critical for your competitiveness. If you feed the chicken more feed rather, then it's more expensive. That's your big cost. And the feed conversion is all about genetics. It's all about the genetics of the bird, that it converts it as quickly as possible without wasting the energy. And the genetics of chicken are the most concentrated genetics in the world. So this is the cheapest source of protein, but incredibly concentrated. There are just 2 breeders that control 90% of all the breeding stock in the world. It's Apple and Android, as one writer said, right? It's Facebook and Google. And the money involved in the consumption of poultry is basically up there with the money that we spend on digital advertising if you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation. So it's really, it's a really big issue, big picture. These companies then organize around the actual producers of the chicken to which they license the breeds, and that drives sourcing of feed, and that drives maize and soybean production and trading around the world for animal feed, including that big change that we've seen in terms of production of soybeans. So when we talk about participation in value chains, we're often talking about the small growers of the chickens. Those small growers' chickens are sandwiched between. They may be informal. People ask me, what do you think about informal? Informal farmers in this context are right in between. In Malawi and Tanzania where we work, almost all the chickens are sold as live chickens. Okay? People slaughter them at home, or you can pay somebody to slaughter them right there. It doesn't mean they're not using these breeds. There are some local breeds, but in terms of the commercial chicken production in bulk, they're still using these breeds. They're part of this value chain. And if we look at what's happened, we've seen big changes happening in this value chain. We've seen some countries expanding their soya production, still very, very low. And as you can see, that blue is Malawi and orange is Zambia, yellow is Uganda. These countries are becoming net exporters of soy and soya meal, and they're exporting it to countries like Tanzania and Kenya. So this is trade within Africa, in this value chain for this staple food, this poultry food. They're also exporting, as I said, to UAE, India, China, etc. So this is being exported from countries like Malawi and Zambia last year. This year, with the poor rains and low planting, not through. And the question is, how is this market and this trade working? And how is this then linking up to returns to farmers in this? And they will look at the breeding stock and come back to it. And the breeding stock is also traded. You import your grandparents or your great-grandparents from France or the UK or the Netherlands, because that's your IP. So you import those great-grandparents, and then you have a breeding operation, and you grow them, your parents, and the parents produce the day-old chicks, and the day-old chicks are a chicken in 6 weeks. So that's your business model, okay? So it's 6 weeks to get a chicken, 2-kilogram chicken. And I'm still not vegetarian. So this poultry industry, cheapest source of protein, right, in the world, very important in terms of stunting rates, etc., this is where it comes from. And it links back to all the small-scale farmers, because in Zambia, 80% of the soya is small and medium farmers. So you've got participation in value chains, of smaller producers, the farming level, growing the chickens, and then at the household consumption level. You've got your day-old chicks. So Zambia is now a hub for exporting day-old chicks. They get the grandparents in, and then they export to countries like Tanzania and Kenya as a regional hub. So let's look at how these markets are working. The first thing is that the soya market looks like the maize market. The farmer, the bulk price in Zambia, I'm going to use Zambia as an example, is a lot of volatility, which is a whole story in and of itself. The harvest is around April, May. That's what the farmers are getting for their soya, right? And then the consuming areas are in the cities, big cities, so it's Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, some going to Johannesburg, okay? Again, you see these massive wedges. So farmers are getting low prices for their soya, and the price landed in those countries is very, very high. So countries like Kenya are importing frozen chicken because they're not competitive. The prices are so high. So they're importing. Why are they importing? Well, it somehow costs an awful lot to get your soya all the way to Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Much more on top of the transport costs. And these margins are actually bigger than the maize, because soya is roughly twice as expensive as maize, so the scale is bigger, right? So we've calculated roughly how big the excess margins were over this period between the Zambian price plus transport costs, which is the grey line, compared to the price landed in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. So how are chicken producers in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam ever going to be competitive? They're not. So you've got the best place to grow soya, and the farmers are receiving prices below the world price. The world price tends to be around $500 a ton, right, for soya, $500 to $600 in the kind of middle there. Farmers are getting really terrible prices, and the producers of the value-added product are paying high prices. So these markets, there is trade. These markets are broken. They're not working. This wedge here is as if you've got loads of high tariffs in here, in between. Okay, and it's driving a distance which is similar to the distance within Europe, or within America, from the American Midwest to the big cities, or within Brazil, from Mato Grosso to Sao Paulo and Rio. That's the kind of distances we're talking about when we look at a map. So what's going on here? And this is where we get to the competition issue about how are these markets organized and how do they work? How does trade really work for these markets? The kind of, we're like investigative journalists, really. Sorry, I'm going to jump back in. So I mean, the first thing is that they are very concentrated. The breeding stock is concentrated, but also the crushing and processing of the soya beans are concentrated. The trader and processor concentration. It's a tight oligopoly. So you may have heard about the work being done on concentration in global traders, your Cargills, etc. Those are not the players here. There are regional traders and processors that are responsible for the majority of what's going on here. And then the next thing is that it's having a huge knock-on effect also on production, because the farmers are getting paid so little that they actually, this year essentially, Zambian farmers planted half of the soya they planted last year. So we're kind of going backwards, and that's the production data. It's from net exports to net imports. The Zambian blue line is the tons of production this year. There were poor rains, but they also planted half of the seed the year before. So here's the market outcomes that come out of this in terms of, remember, your chicken is very simple. You get your day-old chicks and you feed it. Okay, you've got to put up sheds, etc., etc. That's what you do. And there's phytosanitary things, you've got to do all of that. These are the broiler day-old chick prices compared to Brazil as a benchmark. Brazil still has a concentrated industry, but their government spends a lot of time looking and checking and monitoring all the time what's going on. So if you're a poultry producer in Brazil, you're getting a day-old chick. You were getting it around less than 30 US cents a chick. Now it's gone up to about 45 cents. If you're in Tanzania, you're paying over 90 US cents, 3 times the price. Okay, so that's on the breeding side. There's questions about why is that the case. That's the breeding duopoly as it plays out in different countries. Zambia's in dollars. The middle part was a big depreciation in 2020. That's the dip, and the price adjusted. On the feed side, which is the soya and maize, you can see also very, very high prices for a kilo of feed. So what we found out, and as, I'm not going to go into this, but we've essentially found out that independent poultry producers are completely squeezed. they're completely squeezed out of all production. So all this work about inclusive value chains, unless you deal with this, it's a waste of time. It's a complete waste of time. It doesn't mean that there isn't growing poultry production, because the big feed producers and the big poultry producers are vertically integrated, and they're not paying these prices. These are the prices in the markets. These are the prices if I'm going out there and I'm buying in a market. Not small, if I'm buying commercially. Okay? If I'm buying, these are from interviews with commercial producers. So it's not your tiny little small scale producer, this is the market prices if you're an independent African producer, a local producer, if you like, in the Tanzania or a Zambia or a South Africa. And so we're seeing that essentially the story about trade and food markets is really a story about oligopoly. It's a story about understanding the concentration of production, and not the production at the farming level, but production in terms of processing and trade. There are 4 companies that dominate the soy production across East and Southern Africa. And they dominate it, so no matter how much you do about digital tools for farmers, you're not going to change the power dynamic. So there's been a lot of money and effort put into, Kenya has more digital tools, I think, than anywhere else. The Kenyan price, I'll put it there, the Kenyan prices are probably among the worst. If you don't believe me, there's an American Economic Review article about maize markets, Berquist and Dynasty, which finds cartels within Kenya, they're marked up 30%, despite all of the digital tools that are there. Commodity exchanges. Let's make exchanges work so we can open up these markets. If I'm one of those 4 soya producers, why would I trade on a commodity exchange? Why would I make, I don't want, so these exchanges exist, and you can go and look at them, you can look at the agricultural commodity exchange in Malawi, you won't find up-to-date prices, you won't find trade going on. So these are initiatives that there's been a lot of energy put in. They exist. There's a trade exchange exists in Kenya. There's been a lot of effort also put on working with the big companies to set up information systems to get this. So the East African Grains Council, which is the large producers, has a regional agricultural trade intelligence network funded by USAID. That network was open access, and then they closed it in 2021. So they know the data, they know the prices every single day, but nobody else has access to the data. So this is a really, really big question. Even to get this far, we've had to go and do the investigative journalism that's there. So how did we get here? Well, back to a global picture. How do we get to just 2 chicken producers in the world? Because that's the most concentrated one. And this is where we come to the policy kind of questions and the referees or the rule makers for markets. There's been a whole series of mergers. There were about 26 major, and this is obviously not our work, this is all reference to other people. In the early 1990s, 1980s, 26 major breeders in the world. They all got sucked up into these 2 big breeders, the EW Group, EW Avignon Group, and Tyson, which has got a joint venture with Hendrix. Tyson's a US company, EW Avignon is a European company, not listed, it's a family-held company. And there's a joint venture, Hendrix is a Dutch company, it's a joint venture for breeding stock with Tyson. So there's a global duopoly, and they look like they're 50. So this is like, so the referees have been sleeping, right? The referees have been sleeping. Which referees approved these mergers? Well, the UK authority approved the merger where EW Group bought out Hubbard in 2018. When I go and read the decision, merger decision, it's about 6 pages, they said this is not an issue. Why is it not an issue? Well, one of them is in more slower growing breeds, and the other one's in fast growing breeds, and so they're not in the same markets. It's a wild decision to read. I worked at the authority, so it's not, I didn't work on this merger, but I worked in the competition authority, the UK's competition authority, right? You look at it like, what did just happen here? And that was approved in the UK for the world. Right? The birds that this Hubbard Group Grimo was using, that's the slow-growing breed that's used in Tanzania. Right? So this is what's been happening quietly while we've been paying lots of attention to digital platforms. Okay? This has all been going on in the background. People are looking at this. I mean, the Biden administration, antitrust, there's been a lot of time working on food markets. It's not as if people haven't noticed around the world. And then these global rights, they get licensed out across regions in the world. So this is across Africa. Red is the bird from the EW Group, and blue is the bird from Tyson, Cobb 500 it's called. They're called things like Ross 306 and Cobb 500. They're like car models, these birds, because they produce a version of the bird for 1,600 meters up in Johannesburg, and they have one for sea level. Because if you're 1,600 meters up, there's less oxygen, so they need slightly different lungs, right? So they've got these, this is the intellectual property that keeps on being developed to optimize their performance. And then these two companies directly are involved in the poultry production in the different African countries. They've got networks of shareholdings, and this is work that we're still writing up now, directly into the different countries. So, well, what's this got to do with what's happening in Malawi, for example? Remember we showed you the price of day-old chicks in Malawi? Well, Tyson, through a company called Ivans, a company called Buchan, has got a license for Central Poultry in Malawi. Central Poultry has 80% of the breeding stock in Malawi. They're the monopoly in Malawi. So yes, this is directly about decision-making of those day-old chicks that are then being grown by these poultry producers, which is the price of the cheapest protein in Malawi. It's not only the maize side, it's the maize staple. Now we're looking at the price of the cheapest protein, right, in Malawi. So yes, this story goes directly down to the producers on the ground. And similar pictures emerge in other countries. Malawi is the most concentrated. In Kenya, the largest producer only has about 50 or 60% of the market. And then you say, well, why should we be skeptical about these companies? Maybe they're nice companies and they're competing vigorously. Well, we know this is not the case. The US has uncovered a cartel in 2021, and a series of cases from then. And this is interesting from a competition economics point of view and from a legal point of view for a number of reasons. The cartels were not only to increase the price of chicken, but they have outsourced contract growers to reduce the returns that are paid to the farmers. They don't sell the day-old chicks to the farmers. The farmers contract grow. The farmer never takes owner of the chicken in the US. So they colluded to reduce the amounts paid to the farmers, and they colluded to reduce the wages that they were going to pay for workers in the abattoirs. This is all the poultry producers in the US. And this includes Tyson. So this is one of the parties. So it's not a hypothetical thing about them colluding. And then they controlled it through an interesting thing is that they then set up a system to monitor and control the flows of the volumes through the market. If you control volumes, you control prices, right? So they don't set the prices, they control the volumes going through. And they do this, it's all digitalized. This is all through benchmarking software. So this is where we get to the digitalization. This is all digitalized, and they send all of this data to a company called agri-food. And when the US tried to prosecute the cartel in a jury trial, the jury didn't convict the managers of colluding because they said that all they're doing is they're sending their data in. So they're now running another trial against this company, agri-food, just on the information sharing. So they didn't meet in a room and say, we are going to agree this. Okay? Set up through a digitalized system. It's not really a platform, but set up through that. And in the context of this incredibly high levels of concentration. All right, so that's a little bit of a depressing story, right? So on the other side, we're doing on time. Ooh, not so good. We start at 10 past. I started talking at 10 past, right? But okay. I was saying, Laura, no, I'll talk for less than 45 minutes. I did till once I get going. It's a problem. So let's look at citrus. So citrus is there's negative parts, but it's a good story. South Africa is the second largest citrus exporter in the world after Spain. Okay, this is and the success in citrus totally outstrips any other product. Red is wine. You can see South African wine; it's there. Red is wine. Export earnings. The black line is citrus. It's an incredible. So what happened here? And it's not just South Africa. The Citrus Growers Association in South Africa operates across southern Africa. It operates in Botswana, Eswatini, in Zimbabwe. It's actually a regional organization. And it's almost 2/3 exported, there are local. What happened here? Well, there was massive liberalization of this industry. Under apartheid, this industry in South Africa up to 1994, this industry was controlled by marketing boards. They were all swept aside in 1996. Shock liberalization. Is it a response to liberalized markets? The answer is no. Okay? The Citrus Growers Association of Farmers organized themselves, and organized around 1,400 farmers, 100,000 employees, And they've essentially, with the government, have been managing the markets. Now, we say managing the markets, we'll come to what that means. This just shows you where the growth has come from. It's been an upgrading process. The growth has come largely from soft citrus, lemons and limes, and your soft easy peelers. This has got intellectual property in it. You can't, if you look at your easy peelers, that they're all licensed. Right? You'll see your Tan Gold, whatever, Citro Gold. These are all licenses. They were mainly developed in Spain or California, right? So that's where it's come from. It's come from upgrading into these types of products. This is the average prices per ton. So they're getting much higher prices for the citrus. Okay? There is growth of oranges as well, and mainly for juicing. This is an incredible story. It has transformed. Okay? The complicated value chain, you say, well, it's just about oranges. Why is this, what's this better? So first of all, you've got to have the cultivar. So just like the chicken, you've got to have the intellectual property. And then there's a whole lot of inputs around crop protection, around marketing. So the industrialization of freshness. That product lands on your shelf just around the corner through a combination of all of these things. The intellectual property, the variety, the plant treatment, etc., the monitoring, meets all of the European, now UK requirements, right? In terms of all of the things that have to happen. How have all of these things been achieved from a farm in Southern Africa to the value that has been got, the high value products that have been achieved here? The first thing is that in this industrialized, or the main thing is that the association levies itself. It has an export levy, and this is a government, and they invest those levies in research and development. The levies on the right-hand side, they just ramped the levies up in 2022, and the green line is research. So the Citrus Growers Association taxes themselves and invests it in R&D. But it's more unique than that. Other horticulture products in South Africa do the same thing. They created companies. And this is essentially a cooperative, right? This is an organization of the farmers. They don't call themselves a cooperative, but they all vote based on their shares as a cooperative. Okay? They created their own cultivar company. So they are entrepreneurial. Called the Citrus Growers Association Cultivar Company, and they negotiate around the intellectual property rights of cultivars. And they've got nurseries that produce the cultivars to deliver the trees. Very different from your avocados, Laura, you're talking about, right? And they've actively nurtured other varieties. They've created more competition in varieties. So they've done this in a global industry. The more we looked at it, this can't be real. This is too good to be true. There are farm workers on the farms aren't getting paid great salaries, right? So it's not like they're necessarily charitable organizations. It's creating employment, but farm work employment can be precarious. They're also investing in plant treatment chemicals. One of the treatment chemicals is supplied by Monsanto. They've created a company which has created a new product which competes with Monsanto. It's called River Biosciences, the company, and they've done this. They've digitalized their supply chain so that farmers can, at a lower cost, comply with all the requirements and developed a platform to do this, cycling platform that all the farmers can use. In other words, they've changed the balance of power between the growers and the concentrated parts of the value chain. And in the South African context, there's clearly a really big emphasis of the government on transformation, on black farmers participating in this. That's a small part of the levy, and this is where they have this fight with the government backwards and forwards. The transformation part is specifically targeted at supporting black farmers. All farmers benefit from the R&D, right? Essentially to participate into export markets. So you've got a series of collective actions that have flowed from the association through using resources, through investment, and working with the government. It's the government that levies, that imposes the levy. It's the government that negotiates market access with the EU, with China, etc. So this is all working with the government. Okay. Where does the kind of the EU's regulations come in about sustainability? Well, the EU sustainability things has actually made it much more difficult for South Africa to export products which use less chemicals and are organic, because they become so successful that, of course, they're competing with Spanish growers. And so citrus is, you may say, well, we shouldn't be, what about our air miles, etc.? Citrus is sea freight. This is not like your green beans, right, that have been flown in from Peru. It's coming by sea, okay? So in terms of your carbon footprint, it's much less. But the regulations that are being put on are on the face of it, and this is a much bigger set of questions that I'm not going to talk about. We could talk about in discussion, which is, I know David has written about this, which is a lot of the regulations that are being developed in Europe are being written by the incumbents, and they're being written by the incumbents with, for them, intended consequences, but we would look at it as unintended consequences to protect those vested interests that are inside. There's the deforestation law in the EU. The deforestation law in the EU essentially means you cannot cut down a single tree. Now, if you're expanding your agricultural production in Zambia, actually you have to verify you have not cut down a single tree. If you're doing this in Zambia, they will have to cut down a few trees, right? It's not that there are things growing on the land, it's scrubland, right? So there's a deforestation, there's a whole set of issues around the deforestation law there. We've cut down all our forests, but hey, you can see my frustration coming through here. So this is my wrap up. So we've had, we have a whole set of issues around trade really mattering for adaptation, right? That it's very much important that we have trade is a central part of adaptation to climate change, both within and across borders, okay? Production is going to move a lot, okay? I mean, olive oil is going to come from different places as well. That's just for those who are from Southern Europe. So, that adaptation is all about trade and restructuring of supply chains. This is all about how markets work. So how these markets work is essential. But a lot of the sustainability debates don't pay any attention to market power at all. If you go look at the food system stuff, almost none of it pays any attention to who actually works in these markets. So we come from the competition side and we're like, hey, what's going on? And what we found is kind of worse than we thought. We're skeptical by nature, because once you've investigated a few cartels, you become very skeptical, right? You realize the easiest way to make money is not to compete. And so it's really important that we understand and we think about the frameworks of analysis which look at those political economy interests and look at how incumbents can act as gatekeepers, raise barriers to entry and impose costs on vulnerable and smaller members of the supply chain. The integration has largely ignored this, and part of it is a merger issue. These mergers have gone ahead. There's mergers in the trading world as well. And then the coordination of those arrangements are not happening through agreements that are easy to see. The companies have digitalized. These are all happening through information sharing arrangements. That's why the US case is so interesting. Those companies are not setting up an information sharing arrangement for the US. Why would they stop at the border with Mexico? Why would they stop at the border with Canada? Why would they stop at... They're setting up a system. Okay? They've set up a system. That's what's in the document. So we've got to think about understanding multidimensional market power across and along value chains, and think about how we would be those power balances can be changed. And the citrus industry shows the potential, because there actually is huge potential. Certainly in East and Southern Africa, massive potential. I mean, it's not a joke, but when we're talking to people in Uganda, we're like, well, climate change is a growth strategy for you, because Uganda has water and land everywhere, right? And incredibly, but their producers are, if you like, stranded. They're far from the markets, and they're very vulnerable within those market chains. So they're not able to invest and earn the returns that would allow them to invest in irrigation, water management, plant treatment, etc. Okay, this is the kind of challenge that we have. So last slide. So we're saying that competition policy, not necessarily competition enforcement, but competition policy needs to be central in food systems transformation, and needs to think. So the competition agenda, in terms of competition authorities, also needs to change, because competition authorities have mainly used kind of microeconomics first year, if you like, assuming that it's all static. We need to think about it as a dynamic process about how firms evolve and protect their positions over time. And this has changed in many of the world's competition authorities because of digital platforms. So the rules for how competition authorities work are being rewritten at the moment. and they're being rewritten because of Google and Facebook and Amazon, etc. So instead of saying, we must prove that you have broken the law, then we'll investigate you, and after 10 years we might fine you, which is how competition works. Okay? The rules are being rewritten to say, no, the onus is on you because of your concentration to prove to us that you're behaving responsibly. And we're saying, those are the rules that we need for food markets. We need those rules for food markets. So in the UK, if you have strategic market status, if you're a digital platform with strategic market status, and they're trying, government's deciding who those are at the moment, but certainly Google, then you're subject to a set of obligations about how you can behave. The EU terminology is gatekeeper. So it's a quasi-regulatory, market-shaping set of frameworks, essentially, for how firms behave. And this means also changing institutions to make sure that authorities can analyze, balance interests, and use regulatory levers to change how markets are working. So this is a big change in institutions that are required. So competition authorities are becoming markets authorities. They're becoming referees that change the rules of the game all the time. And the CMA, the UK CMA, is a really good example of this. I've thrown stones at them for this poultry merger, but they're looking at vulnerable consumers. They've looked at loyalty penalties in insurance. They've looked at care homes, the concentration there. So they're looking at these things. And this is actually a leader globally. And that's something which says we've got these independent bodies that can go out there and get data, because now the data is almost all private in big companies. So the first thing is you need to be able to see. Then you need to be able to rule make. It's a bit like, if you're looking at sports analogies, like, rugby changes the rules all the time, right? This is what we're talking about. It's going to change the rules all the time to see how people are adapting. It's a test and learn approach. Before it was like, everything is fine unless we've proven that you've broken the law, like you're a traffic cop. You can do whatever you want, but if you break the law, we'll try and prove it, and it'll be a long, litigious process. Now we're saying, no, tell us what you're doing. We don't like that so much. Let's think about tweaking the rule. It's a bit dangerous. That's where we're going with some of the digital platforms. The question is whether that's possible. And the last point I want to make is that from a political economy point of view, mobilizing constituencies is critical. Because these things will not, the incumbents are naturally powerful. So it will not change unless constituencies are mobilized around this. So a really interesting discussion is, how did the citrus farmers mobilize around this, but the poultry farmers have not? So this is the mobilization and kind of political story around this across different countries. This is all essentially a big research agenda. So if you're interested in these things, then that's our research agenda. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, that was wonderful.
It'll take 50 minutes.
Okay, so thank you so much, Simon. So David, would you like to share some comments and questions?
Yeah, indeed, I would. Firstly, Simon, I think that was interesting, very fascinating presentation that you made. Of course, you're approaching this through mainly a competition policy lens, and much of my own comments would be to broaden this up and to look more broadly at African agriculture and some key trends. But I also wanted to make a few comments on what you've presented, and I'll start with citrus, which I think is, as you point out, is a very interesting story, and it's unique. Basically, I don't think I can think of any other product that has a similar structure in terms of how the growers have been able to organize themselves and so on. I can't think of any comparable agricultural product that has a similar structure. Then, of course, the geographical concentration of the fruit itself in Southern Africa, which requires a Mediterranean type climate, also adds to its uniqueness. But just a couple of issues there. One is, as you know, there is an ongoing dispute between the Southern African citrus producers and the EU, that's at the WTO, and it's over the application of sanitary, phytosanitary issues, and I think specifically two challenges that the EU alleges that Southern African citrus fruits face. I think there's the black spot disease and also the codling moth, or whatever it is, disease. But we also know that there are scientific solutions that could be applied to solve this problem, insofar as it is a problem. And I think you alluded to this cold treatment as a possible way of dealing with this. But then, of course, the EU, what appears to be the view of Southern African producers is that the EU is being somewhat protectionist, not just of Spain, as you rightly point out, Spain being the number one producer, but then other countries in Southern Europe as well, being in competition with the Southern African producers. You also pointed out that new markets are opening up anyway for citrus, and I noticed in one of your slides you pointed to China, India, and also regional markets, the rest of Africa. And indeed, people who have traveled around Africa, you can see that in some of the supermarkets and in various places you can find South African citrus fruit. One issue that I think you may need to rethink as regards the story on citrus is this opposition that shipping the fruit by sea freight, is less polluting. I think that is actually being challenged because there is evidence that maritime shipping actually is more polluting than aviation. And right now, there is the International Maritime Organization that's right here in London. There's negotiation that is going on a maritime shipping carbon tax to incentivize ship owners to move towards cleaner fuels and so on. I do have a study on this actually that has just come out. If you look at the website, you'll be able to see what we're saying might be the effect on African countries of this tax, because there are very few African countries that are actually involved in the maritime shipping industry, which does mean that the tax will be passed on, and the benefits from this tax, which would be distributed to ship owners and as part of the whole incentivization process, would mean that the African countries would lose out. But anyway, I just mentioned this because it's not a foregone conclusion that sea freight is less polluting. Two comments. I'm not, I found what you said about poultry, about soya, and the market dynamics. I found all of that fascinating. But two aspects for me stood out as I was processing what you were saying. The first is that what is also driving the high prices in the African context is also the high cost of capital. You did not quite mention that, but we, in work that we did on African agriculture, for example, found that share of bank credit going to agriculture on average is 4%. And then, of course, higher interest rates. So the cost of capital is quite high. But then another aspect is that we found with higher prices, and of course there's also the issue around trade policy, segmenting markets and so on. But what we found about the higher prices is that because African agriculture is primarily small scale smallholders, higher prices actually driving commercialization is what we found. And so we see, for example, medium scale farmers, sort of agglomerating land, to the sort of 10 hectares plus sort of level, beyond small-scale farmers who are, under 5 or under 5 hectares and so on. So that's one effect, unintended effect, so to say, of high prices. Then also evidence of increasing contract farming as well. But basically the story here is growing commercialization of agriculture. You have one of your earlier slides that talked about this quiet revolution. I think part of that is that African agriculture, broadly speaking, is moving towards a much commercial model as opposed to the smallholder, almost subsistence, kind of model. So that also emerged as an insight from our own work. But having said all this, and you rightly point out that this puzzle that the African continent accounts for 60% of the world's arable land, but yet Africa is mainly a net food importer, and actually 42 of the 54 African countries classified by the WTO as net food importers. Also, it has to be said that about 280 million Africans, that's 20% of the population, a fifth of the population, face malnutrition. You talked in passing about stunting, wasting, and these sorts of issues. 340 million Africans, 25% of the population, face hunger or food insecurity in some way. There is no prospect of achieving the SDG 2 by 2030. Given the challenges that need to be overcome. And part of what we try to understand is why is this? Why you have this sort of outcome despite having the land and so on. And of course we had to look at and try to understand that land is only one of the factors of production that's involved here, but there is also, most importantly, capital. I've already alluded to bank credit on average being only 4% and high interest rates. But then African governments themselves, shockingly, are not spending much on agriculture. What we found is that the average is something around 7% of public spending on agriculture. Of course, it's higher. This is average, higher for some countries, but this is below what was agreed in the Continental Plan for Agriculture, which is the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, the CADAP, and that was reviewed initially adopted in 2003 and then reviewed in 2013, and as the Malabo Declaration and so on, that asked African government, or where African governments committed to spend a minimum of 10%, but they're not quite there. So public spending is below even what the African countries, the African governments agreed to. Then when you look at FDI, foreign direct investment, how much of it is going into agriculture? It's only 2%. Again, this is the average. ODI is even more shocking, especially since agriculture is so closely related to poverty and gender and so on. Only 8% of ODI is going into agriculture. So I've already mentioned, but we did look also at private investment, African private investment, and use gross fixed capital formation as a share of agricultural value added as a proxy for that, and that is around 10%. And in other places comparable outside of Africa, it's well into the 20s and 30s. Clearly African agriculture is starved of capital. And what is behind capital, of course, is many of the other things you talked about in relation to poultry, soya, citrus, and all that, the intellectual property, the agricultural inputs, the seeds, the pesticides, the herbicides, and all of these things that you need to spend on. So, clearly African agriculture being starved of the kind of capital input that's needed. We also, in our own work, looked at the 8 key products that we judge to be essential to food security in Africa, to try to understand what the production, the consumption, what are the trends, productivity, and so on. And on these metrics, and using mainly FAO data on these metrics, and looking at these 8 products, and the 8 products were yam, cassava, maize, wheat, rice, poultry, livestock, which of course also includes dairy, and fish. Now, of these 8 products, we found that only yam and cassava were being produced competitively, where production and productivity levels were above a world average, although taking into account that Africa, of course, is a leader in the production of yam. But these are the foods that are most essential to food security in Africa. So what we found is that African production is lagging in all of these areas. If you take a crop like rice, which increasingly is being consumed in urban areas, again we found that production is and productivity is way below world average productivity for rice. But the same applies to all across the board. But then we also try to understand how global trade rules impact African production. And I've already pointed out that land is only one of the factors of production that is at stake here. I'll try to wrap up. The other, of course, being capital. But then what we found is that global trade rules, which allow subsidies at the WTO, those mean that for these products, like maize, rice, poultry, of course, which you've talked about, livestock, and so on, that global trade rules, the subsidies, do have a price suppressing effect on African production, and that also affects African competitiveness and production in these key products. And that, of course, also includes fishery subsidies. We, looked to see how the fishery sector is being undermined by foreign fleets that are subsidized. And as you know, there's been global negotiations on fishery which have not got very far at the WTO. So let me then wrap up by saying that I think your insights on competition policy, how that could be applied to these cases that you mentioned, certainly very strong and powerful. And of course, this interacts with trade policy, as I pointed out, for the specific products that you mentioned. But more broadly also, I think the trade policy lens helps us to understand better what's actually happening, as well as looking at the financing of African agriculture, which, as I've already pointed out, has very serious shortcomings. So, Laura, I think I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to briefly comment, or should I go for some questions as well from... I'm kind of aware that I want to take questions from students too. So maybe you can respond with the questions as well. Okay, so do we have any questions? Please put up your hand. I have so many questions. So Okay, we have a question at the back, and we also have a question right here. Deepa, Noble is back.
Hi,
Very
thank
special.
you. I actually have two questions. One is about the role of the observatory itself. And my question there is whether when you look at markets and how they function, etc., you're also thinking about externalities of markets and how to create policy that prevents those externalities, or whether it's your role is mostly to preserve markets, working as markets, however they end up. So are you thinking about things like impact on climate or impact on labor, etc., etc.? My second question is, what do you think it would take for Africa as a continent to become a much more integrated market within itself, so that it still seems to me from what you were saying that it's very sort of export orientated, but export towards Europe or towards America, etc. And I wonder, given the imbalances that you were mentioning around some parts of the continent being exporters, others being importers, but being a net importer of food when it actually has all the wealth that it needs, as in, nature, land, etc., what would it take for that market to become integrated in itself so that it can solve some of those problems?
Thank you very much. Noble.
Okay. My question is in regards to marketing boards. So I noticed that in South Africa, you said the marketing boards in the citrus or like nationally were abolished, and the organization that happened within the citrus industry and how that was instrumental in transforming the industry. I'm wondering, what is the institutional capacity of marketing boards? Presumably they are what still manages the poultry and soybean industry in the other African countries. What do you think is the institutional capacity and capability of these marketing boards? Because I look at it within the context of marketing boards in Ghana, and I have a long-standing debate with a friend of mine who is an economist as to whether the marketing board responsible for cocoa should be abolished or should stay. This was a debate that was had even after independence, and I always thought it should be retained. So that I'm wondering what could be the role of marketing boards within poultry and soybean industry within these African countries, or whether it should stay or leave, and how that sort of self-organization happened in the citrus industry in South Africa could replicate it across the continent. Thank you.
I have a question that kind of tacks on to that question a little bit, whether the citrus story is partly like a legacy of the apartheid era and sort of big white commercial farms being organized, and how different is that for a very different kind of political economy system. Do we have any more questions in this round? We'll take one more, maybe right behind you.
Thank you very much for a very, very insightful presentation. My question is a follow-on to the gentleman's question and what Laura has just pointed out. I mean, Laura is trying to ask about whether the legacy, kind of the path dependency explanation of this, institutional path dependency as having an effect on organization or collective action. My question is kind of the reverse, like, what has been the role of the state in supporting? I mean, on one hand, the state represents the sector, and on the other hand, we saw kind of the emergence of this association, the citrus sector in South Africa. So what was the role of the state in supporting the citrus association, and maybe the extent to which the citrus association sort of conditioned the behavior of the state to provide a more supportive regulatory framework? Because we see that there's been, following liberalization, there's been kind of, an evolution of cooperatives or producer associations across most African countries. So I was wondering whether, this kind of unique case has some kind of unique explanation to it in terms of the relations between the South African state and the producer association.
Thank you. Those are all very difficult questions. Maybe, can we start with you, Simon? I know the question about regional trade integration, David will definitely want to take a bite out of that, but Do you want to? Maybe we'll ask David to.
No. Simon first.
Okay.
And you might want to comment on if anything I said earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I will. Thanks very much for the question. Thanks very much for all the comments. Really, really useful, really interesting. And I'm not going to be able to do them justice, so I might get my caveat in first. So in terms of what we're doing, briefly, what we're doing is trying to be one piece of the jigsaw puzzle, right? In terms of this. And so yes, we care about externalities. Yes, we care a lot about what are the other. So we work on fertilizer. That's a very obvious case, right? I mean, it's really important that fertilizer is used effectively, that is tailored to big land. And so the debate in fertilizer, and we're not agronomists, has become very much about: do you believe in regenerative agriculture or not? It becomes almost like no fertilizer, no chemical fertilizer. I mean, Tanzania's fertilizer usage, I think, is 20 kilos per hectare. The UK is 180 kilos per hectare. Like, okay, guys, stop here, then we'll worry about it over there. I mean, I have no view one way or the other on that kind of thing, but obviously you want to stop excessive fertilizer use, and obviously don't want to have polluting the waterways, etc. There's there. But we're just trying to be the market power part of the jigsaw puzzle, right? This is the thing, work along with all the other people that are working on these other issues. And of course, labor rights, and we do work more on labor issues, but if you're a farmer that is getting completely squeezed, you're going to have to exploit probably family labor even to just sustain yourself. The returns in that production are going to be necessary as part of the improvement of labor rights. In citrus, part of being part of the international value chain is actually they're subject to a whole lot of labor standards because it's ending up on shop shelves in Europe. Of course, there are people trying to duck and dive around that, but there's a lot of work that's opened up around this, and so that becomes a very active area. What will it take to be more integrated? Well, clearly we think you need to pay a lot of attention to market power. That integration is not going to happen without understanding who controls the markets. It's very much work in progress. So, we're keen to engage more. In terms of marketing boards, I think, it's not about whether marketing boards are good or bad. It's like the kind of, I don't know if the real quote about Mao is like, who cares what color the cat is, does it catch mice? What we're saying is, like, the institutions need to control and rein in the power of incumbents, including the power to influence politicians, to corrupt politicians. Because, of course, trade barriers are often put in place by governments because they are lobbied by vested interests. So if you don't develop institutions to rein in those incumbents, if it's a marketing board or an association, whatever, then you're going to be captured. These industries will be captured, and so the marketing board. So a marketing board may be part of the problem if it's governed by the 2 or 3 big producers, or it may be a good institution which supports a longer-term path. And so it's not about whether it's a marketing board or. So South Africa is really interesting as an example, as a lab experiment, because the apartheid regime had marketing boards for everything: potatoes, tomatoes, cucumber. I kid you not, there was a marketing board for everything, right? They were run for the white farmers. So there were marketing boards for the white farmers. The ANC came in 1996 and had a debate, and there was an ODI fellow came along and did all this stuff, and you can read this, and he said, get rid of all the marketing boards, markets will work. Well, markets have not worked very well, right? This is where you said, is citrus a legacy? But no, because nothing else. Legacy would apply to everything. The interesting thing about citrus is what made the farmers able to get together and organize and reconstitute about 5 years later, and other sectors did not do so. Sugar, I would say, sugar never abolished the marketing board. Sugar is still, in our view, completely run by the 3 big producers, which are not South African producers. Associated British Foods is the biggest sugar farmer. So they're run for the interests of the producers. So it's really it's a counterexample that it performed, which is interesting. And it is but the lessons that are being learned from that are being used for other produce. So in berries, etc., and other stone fruits, peaches, pommes, but also for other things. So it's that, and I don't want to oversimplify it. there's a lot of dynamics that went on between different parts of the country, and there's lots of interesting things that happened in different parts of the country around this. And Shingi Chisora is working on this collective action, comparing it to wine. This is her PhD. She's doing a lot of trying to understand how did this happen through a mixture of design and accident and coincidence. And it's a messy story. But also say that marketing arrangements and rules, if you've got market power, we think are essential. Otherwise, if markets are not competitive and they're concentrated, you're going to have that power being used to exploit and exclude. The state's really important in citrus. I mean, the state actually does make the rules. So the Citrus Growers Association has to work with the state. They're managing upwards, right? It's really interesting. And we're privileged in a sense because we work a lot with the government, so we actually are part of those discussions. And we're seeing this happening in kind of real-time participant observation as a group. Somebody else has done a lot of time working on wine. So that's my, I think that's the question that there. In terms of David's point, the point about capital and investment, I agree. I mean, the underinvestment is phenomenal, right? It's incredible. But I think what we're finding is that it's not a surprise. I mean, it's not a surprise to see how little investment is happening in soya farming in Zambia if the prices that farmers are getting paid are so low. It's not a surprise to see underinvestment in poultry farming next to the big cities if the prices that they are paying for feed are so high. It's not profitable to invest. So it's not. I wouldn't put ODI into this stuff either. Because why are you going to invest? I mean, we've done work on the feed association in Kenya. The small guys have exited the market. It's not a surprise. I mean, it's not. It wouldn't be you're investing in something which is going to fail. Only the large vertically integrated producers are seeding. So they're going to contract farming, which means they're paying farmers to do it. Those are the vertical. That's not an efficient outcome. That's from our analysis. That's an outcome because you've destroyed the alternative business models, right? Because the market power has made it not. So that's the outcome of that's sugar, that's tobacco, that's cotton. But it doesn't have to be, because the small and medium farmers producing soya in Zambia are producing commercial soya. So they are exporting to China. That soya from the soy farms in that last year is being exported it's medium-sized farmers, and they're investing in irrigation, but they've been squeezed back down in terms of their returns. So we don't think it's a surprise. That's what this shows. We think this is a natural outcome of the failure to have good. It's a bit like saying, why are small football teams failing? Well, I mean, if you succeed because you're allowed to buy whatever players you want, then. But I live in Glasgow. I'm from Scotland originally. I mean, it's not a surprise that there's only 2 teams in Scotland, right? This is not a surprise.
Why is Man U not doing very well
exactly,
this season?
Got a very wealthy.
But on this point also, I think is also we could take into account that government spending does then provide much of the infrastructure, the support, extension services, all these things that can subsidize, in a sense, that subsidize production, which in other parts of the world, whether it's Brazil, India, other places where you have that kind of spending that African farmers don't have. So, and I think the same can be said for ODA, insofar as ODA can help to level the playing field, so to say. That I think that's the case for ODA going into agri. But I take your general point on this. But I think every source of capital, where capital is scarce, is to be welcomed. But it's not there. I think that was the point. Can I? 2 things on the. What will it take to integrate African markets? I think what it will take would be to deal with these non-tariff barriers, which Simon talked about, the market segmentation, the fact that you do have all these trade agreements in place, but they're not really being implemented as agreed, and that includes the AFCFTA itself, which has not, because that's meant to be the answer to your question. It does not actually take enough. As such, but even within the RECs, the regional trade arrangements, as Simon has said, you could have arbitrary decisions being taken to ban imports and that sort of thing. So non-tariff barriers is the key, but it's not just non-tariff barriers related to trade policy. I think also infrastructure is another impediment. Happily, a lot is going on infrastructure. I think some of the corridors we are seeing, especially East and Southern Africa, we are seeing, whether it's Mombasa to Kigali or to Eastern DRC or Dar es Salaam and so on. I think we're seeing a lot of infrastructure going into these corridors, or Walvis Bay across Southern Africa, Durban, and so on. So, that situation is improving. Even in West Africa, we're seeing Lagos, Abidjan, for example, the north-south route. So a lot is happening on infrastructure, but, clearly a lot more needs to be done. But the NTBs are the key issues around why the integration is not yet happening. I also wanted to just make a brief comment on the marketing board, because actually this summer there were some executives from the Ghana Cocoa Board who were here in London, and I was one of the people invited to have a discussion with them. Two things that they pointed out, of course, as executives of the Cocoa Board, they have an interest in preserving the status quo. But they pointed out two things. One is the role that the board plays in price stabilization, because the prices go up and down and so on, and that's a level of protection in having a reference price for cocoa across the board, which is what they use to justify the monopoly. But then also crucially, they're talking about these inputs, which on the supply side, that a marketing board typically is able to negotiate with international suppliers of fertilizers, pesticides, whatever, and be really up to date with the latest scientific evidence on these sorts of issues. So they're saying that that's another role that they're playing. And then, of course, as has been mentioned, as part of this response to climate, you're seeing new regulations like the EU deforestation regulation and so on, where they provide a collective voice, much like the citrus growers, because Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, as you know, coordinate very closely on cocoa. So they provide that collective voice. Actually, the EUDR, because of that kind of pressure, has been put on hold. It's the EU has said that it was meant to have taken off at the end of this year, but the EU has said that they're putting it on hold, and some who think that this might be put on hold indefinitely because the issues around it are so complex on deforestation and so on, and how you prove that, and the sort of kind of technology that's needed, and so on and so forth. Traditionally, marketing boards have had that role in overcoming the market failures that we know. African markets are not that efficient in terms of these sorts of inputs that are required for agriculture. And traditionally, they've played that role. They were scrapped, under structural adjustment. I think that was one of the casualties of marketing board. So not just the end of apartheid and so on, but one of the casualties. And the effect on African agriculture has been very clear. It has not helped African agriculture either. By scrapping these marketing boards.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned in my own project comparing California and Kenya is how important marketing boards were in America too. So the idea that Americans in structural adjustment were advising African countries to disband, it's just, that literally is kicking away the ladder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to go for some more questions. I see that Carolyn has a question. Do we have any? I can also see James and Deepa. Can you come to the front?
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating research. I have a bit of a bigger picture question, and you already touched upon that. I would like to hear both of your perspectives on how the African Continental Free Trade area might affect also these kind of dynamics in competition, and I think they're probably still working on a competition policy. What do you expect that to look like, or what would you expect that to, or what would the influence of that, what might that be on regional value chains and global value chains of these commodities or even different commodities? And I just discussed this for 4 hours in my class, so I told my students to come. I don't see them. But maybe I can get your insights and then talk to my students next week about it. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, Simon, thank you very much. I'm going to pick up from where two of my students in the back row left off. And I would have hoped that one of them pushed you a bit harder on this. So, there you go. This research is really important, and you come up with conclusions that I think are really important, except that what's behind this is a political story. I think you implied it. You implied it with the citrus growers in South Africa. What Michael was asking before about cooperatives and Noble about marketing boards is, again, we're in the political arena here. And if anything's going to change in terms of breaking up these, what we can consider to be socially and economically dysfunctional oligopolies in the food sector, it's going to come down to a question of political organization, isn't it? I mean, the marketing boards, I was glad to hear both of you not condemning marketing boards outright, because there's a lot of evidence of differential performance. What's so key is who controls the marketing boards and how are they wielded to what end? And it's similar. Michael has a story in his research on coffee in Uganda and Kenya, which is really showing that, you know, cooperatives, the different role of cooperatives in the political power equations in Kenya and Uganda have produced really divergent outcomes in terms of how much value producers can capture from coffee in Kenya as opposed to Uganda, for instance. So there's much more of a political story here, and if the results of the research are going to be, you know, go anywhere, you know, it has to be taken up by those who are contesting public power, I think.
And just behind you, if you could just pass.
So I had some questions on the aviation versus shipping discussion. So I just wonder if you could expand on that, like from a cost perspective as well. And then, like, is the emissions also looking at just kind of other aspects? So we're talking about marine life implications.
Yeah.
I thought you said, you said aviation.
Yeah.
I thought you were like the bird chicken. So.
Those chickens flying around?
Sorry. Okay, so we'll take those questions. So maybe this time I'll ask David to go first.
Yeah, okay. I think, James, just to quick point on cooperatives, I think generally cooperatives that by definition owned by the farmers themselves, part of the association and setting the goals and the priorities and all that does lead to capturing more value. No question about that. In our work, when we looked at all the market intermediaries, we put cooperatives right up there. But this is not to say that marketing boards as well, depending on how they're structured and that sort of thing. In the case of the Ghana one, it's also very clear to us, that, as we talk to the executives, that Ghana is in a foreign exchange bind because of the debt overhang and so on, and this is one of the major sources of foreign exchange into the country. So why would the government not want to control it? It's very clear that is part of the thinking. But the activities, the functions are somewhat mixed. But I'll go for the cooperative model, I think, which is a much better model. Sea freight and air freight. Generally, sea freight is cheaper. You can send bulk, at a less unit cost than air freight. But it doesn't mean that the pollution is anything less than, or that sea freight pollution is less than air pollution. There are some studies on this. You could go check it out. Sea freight is said to account for 3% of global greenhouse gases, which is why there is this effort to switch and provide incentives for ship owners to switch to cleaner fuels, much like you find in other transportation sectors. So the decarbonization of the shipping sector is a huge it's a big story right now, and as I said, right here in London, the negotiations are going on in the International Maritime Organization. One of the big issues is how you redistribute the revenues from the carbon tax. And as I pointed out, for the countries that use shipping but do not own the ships and so on, what role would they have? What would they receive? For work that, for financing that could go into odd sectors that do produce, goods and so on that use shipping. So the auto shipping sectors, how could you use that kind of funding to support decarbonization adaptation in other sectors? So that's one of the issues that is sort of being discussed. As I said, I do have a paper on this. If you look under my staff profile, you'll find this report, which actually we did and came out in September.
Sure. I mean, the James question at the end. I mean, this is the last bit on the slide, right? This is what we do. So I can. So I mean, it's important, say we're just a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, right? But if you don't have any information, then it's very difficult to exert leverage. What we do, and you give me the opportunity to talk more about what we do, is we gather information and feedback information to different market participants that are, if you like, the smaller or the medium size. So we work with cooperatives in Malawi, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Because the cooperatives are trying to vertically integrate down into trading and processing, right? So they're integrating, so they're using our data to make the case to get funding to invest in actually vertically integrating from soya, so they don't have to sell into crushing into animal feed. So the cooperative needs to vertically integrate. Our data provides the business case for them to go off to your Gates Foundation or whatever to do that, right? So we work with cooperatives there. We also work with a really impressive group run by the Graça Machel Trust of women entrepreneurs. So these are independent entrepreneurs in agribusiness. We gather data from them and feed it back. We literally, on WhatsApp, we say, so when I'm talking about the poultry producers, these are people in their network. So they have a network, they're mobilizing a constituency, and the Graça Machel Trust has got the ability to call governments to account. What they don't have is the results that show how they're failing because of unfair prices. They say, I see this feed price, and the company says, well, that's a fair price. You're obviously not a good poultry producer. It's like, no. We said to them, and they had a summit literally 2 weeks ago. And we literally said, you are being set up to fail. You're going into it with both your hands tied, but what you've got to do is mobilize. But we're not. I mean, we're researchers, right? So we're not. We're very humble about what we're doing. But yes, we want to make. And then what we do is we work with competition authorities. So we work on inquiries and investigations with the authorities. These are young institutions. So this takes to the AFCFTA question. So there are these young institutions, really young institutions, and they're obviously buffeted by political influences, etc. But they're also put under pressure. I mean, the Kenyan authority, for example, I mean, if you get into, public transport in Nairobi, you will hear about their work being discussed, and that puts countervailing pressure as well. So they must tackle these things. This is part of the AFCFTA is trying to do a competition authority for the whole of Africa. Right now, it's not the regional bodies, only in COMESA is functioning. So we kind of look at it and we're like, yeah, no, it's a great idea. We really support it. But hey, it would be great if the East African Competition Authority would be operating effectively so that we could deal with some of these issues. And there's a tripartite, which is SADC, COMESA, and East Africa. That's a market. That's not in the same market as West Africa. Like, it's not remotely in the same market for any of these things. So the tripartite needs to work first, right? Which is, and SADC doesn't have a competition authority. So there's a long way to go. It would be good if Africa spoke with one voice on some of the things like the really big global mergers. So your Bayer Monsanto, Bunge Viterra, etc. Might be the really big, truly global mergers, but the regional bodies need to come. And that's a legacy of the colonial borders, partly as well, right? So that the legacy of the colonial borders has meant you need these regional bodies because they're regional markets. It's even more difficult to set up the institutions to work, or these cooperatives to work, because of the legacy of these colonial borders that draw lines on maps where, it kind of literally makes no sense other than that logic. So that's kind of where we are there. There are some positive developments. I mean, Tanzania, and this is through the mixture of cooperatives and regulatory boards. So Tanzania has a much more cooperative-led state involved, and they are really starting to move around. So Tanzania is 10 million tons of maize, 4 million tons in last year, fed Zambia and Malawi this year, right? It would have been much worse if they had not increased their production by smallholder farmers through state-led action with the cooperatives. So there's some really positive developments happening there. And the other thing we'll be thinking is the whole debate about buffer stocks, because with climate change, these localized shocks, it's clear that there's a clear case for essentially creating mechanisms, because the impact on vulnerable households is so severe. And so that's another issue to put on the agenda.
Okay, I think the last thing that I want to ask you both, and I mentioned it before, is that a lot of our students are thinking about dissertation topics. So I wanted to ask you, from what you've observed in your own research, what are the kind of uncertainties that you think somebody needs to go and investigate? What are the areas that you think will be kind of fruitful avenues for students to start poking around in?
Want me to go first?
You can
yeah.
go.
Okay. In the research that we did, I had a eureka moment, and the eureka moment was when we were looking at the effect of WTO rules, and basically we sort of recognized that the subsidies allowed by the WTO makes food available on this planet. There is enough food for everybody on this planet, because food is heavily subsidized. So I've always thought that these subsidies, which of course there's a lot of evidence about price oppression and so on, and how it affects production in other places that don't have these subsidies. So I've always thought that these subsidies should be removed, that it has this negative effect. But then one realized that these subsidies do also make food available globally. So there's that aspect. I think that there is scope to investigate this a lot more, because it's very easy to condemn the WTO and the rules and so on, and the green box, the blue box that allow these things. Incidentally, there is a development box, and for the African countries, they're not using it because they don't have the fiscal space to do so. So I think that there is still scope to look at how WTO rules affect global agriculture, and what indeed this balance between making food available globally and the effect, the negative effect that it could have in some places. So I think there's scope to look into that a bit more.
Okay, thank you. And Simon?
So where do I start? I mean, almost everything that I've said is a potential research question, right? Like literally, because what you've got to do, I think, what we're saying is we've got to we've got to stop just looking for our keys under where the lamp is shining. Because we've got to go and look and build the data, and the data is there. So there's a lot more data out there. Our world data we've used there is, but you've got to go and say, what do we need to understand, and where are we going to get the data to find those things out? You can get prices from the trade data. So you can look at this. The concentration stuff, you can put it together from some of the companies are listed, etc. But we are doing the market observatory so that people can do dissertations on it. I mean, in our team, we have people are doing their PhDs. It's like this is what's happening. Somebody's doing a PhD on citrus compared to wine, searching the source. It's all accessible. And we've got somebody else doing it on chicken, and she's only doing it in 3 countries. There's another 2 countries you can look at. And then there's lots of stuff around. I mean, this whole protein transition. This whole protein transition is playing out in real time, right, across these countries. So looking at India's changing protein demand, and it's already impacting on world prices, and it's impacting on East Africa. So because it's non-GM, and East Africa is non-GM, right? So there's a whole dynamic there around trade flows around this. And so the food markets are changing really quickly all the time, and obviously matters a lot. So don't be shy about getting in touch. We're also surveying the entrepreneurs in the Grassroots Trust Network. We're just sending out a survey right now to 1,000 entrepreneurs who are out there on their experiences in agriculture, and we're going to get some information back, and then we're going to try and do focus groups and follow-ups. Like, we're tiny. But you'll have to take initiative, right?
Okay, so I want to thank you both. I thought this was such a wonderful talk. I mean, the way that you kind of linked it to climate and competition and trade, and there is so much richness here. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us and sharing your research and sharing your ideas with us. I just want to say next week we're going to be joined by Sheba Tajani from King's College London, who's going to be talking about saffron geographies of exclusion in India and thinking about the broader political economy of Modi. So please come back next week, and in the meantime, might see you in the pub, or if not, have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everybody. Oh, and thank you. Yeah, that's
Thanks.
really excellent.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Thank you very much, David. I'm sorry I said conclude, but I
No,
want to go to the
it's important to get the questions. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, it was very wonderful. I loved it. It made me think so much.
So we get a free notebook at
Thank
least.
you very much. Should I sign out of it?
Yeah, we really
there's
there's
11.
a lot of trade. We're scratching the surface, I think.
And guys, there is another event at 6. So if we can let the next group have the room.
One of the things, we also thinking is nobody's the case of the integration.
Yeah. Do you guys know what happened to my bag?
You leave it in the you leave it in the room. There you go.
Yeah.
Hello. Mic check 1 2. Hello. Mic check 1 2. Hello.
aşağıya alalım sadece üst kata almayalım.
Hello?
Don't send them to the top floor, okay? Here.
Hello, mic
But
check 1
please
2.
sit them nicely, okay?
Hello? Hello, mic check 1 2.
Just a moment. So could you please put them maybe here? Or here.
Oh, sorry. I'm very sorry. My bag